evolved facades, about facades gaining significance, and I think this is just a good question mark to start out with. Is this the right way to approach a main street? I was fooled until I actually looked up and then went, what about that? And I don't know if, where did Audrey go?
I'm right
There you
here.
are.
I'm just looking myself.
I'm wondering, we'll be seeing more substitute materials as we go along, and I think
There is a big debate when you're trying to restore a vanished feature. Oh, here we go again. All right. Is this one on?
Hello?
Oh. When you're trying to restore a vanished feature, or you have, basically when you have a storefront like this, if you have historical or physical evidence of what this storefront looked like originally, or over a period of time, and you may have a very modern facade which perhaps does not contribute to the building and is not a very sympathetic change to the building, you might want to go back if historically appropriate and put a more compatible storefront on. I don't know anything about the history of this building. I imagine that this is, what it looked like originally, and to replicate these types of features would be very, very expensive. So the first temptation is to find some of the substitute materials that are available on the market. The National Park Service has what we call a preservation brief on sustainability. Sustainability is everywhere, on substitute materials, and we have this sort of debate on where the use of substitute materials is appropriate. Sometimes it is prohibitively expensive to replicate some of these very fine details. Sometimes you don't have the craftspeople available to actually, who still know how to do the work, which is very unfortunate. And so there is a debate, and I'm not saying here whether it's right or wrong to use it, but you have to figure out where substitute materials are appropriate. We also think in terms of how, are the materials still available? Is the craftsmanship still available? And sometimes the argument is, yeah, the materials are still available, so you shouldn't use substitute. You can use the real thing because it's readily available. Here, they did, it looks like, lovingly try to restore this thing to its original appearance. But, you did fool Natascha for a little bit, but she got a little closer, and you also wonder about the durability of these materials. You can see that they're already starting to chip a little bit because they don't build them like they used to. So it's an ongoing debate. It's probably in every historic district around the country where substitute materials are appropriate. The vinyl siding, wood siding, hardy plank debate is very rampant. If you don't know what hardy plank is, that's just a trade name for, a product name for cementitious siding that's being used very commonly in lieu of wood siding. Do you want to add it? And I'm not giving you any answers here, but there's always discussion, and every project on a case-by-case basis, the individual circumstances are considered and weighed.
So one criteria visual. So if you have a feature that from the street level, it's like, I don't know if that's a PVC cedar, or if that's.
And I should have, included that in my initial list of things to consider. Is are you visually matching the characteristics of the original materials closely? Sometimes you think, well, maybe you should use the original materials down low, and as you move up in the building where you really can't see them as well, you might use substitute materials. Maybe once in a while there are code restrictions. You have these big, heavy, historic cornices, and sometimes every once in a while you'll get a code official that won't allow you to put that heavy cornice back up for structural reasons, and there are ways to replicate cornices. I'm not necessarily encouraging the use of substitute materials, but it is an ongoing argument, and we do incorporate them, allow them in tax credit projects and rehabilitations on occasion, but it's often, there's a debate that accompanies that. There's always a discussion on what is most appropriate where.
Yeah, and I think that actually I think I'm just bad at the microphone.
No, this is much better. We're doing all the.
I think the closeness to the person is actually a really major kind of description, because the fact that this will get the most abuse and the most critical inquiry that any other material. So like a fake slate on a roof, nobody's going to really get up there and touch it and poke at it. And it is a material though that would take a lot of abuse, but isn't like the kind of visual. We'll notice immediately when this doesn't look as nice as it used to, and it can't quite handle the way cast iron handles it through years.
By a long shot.
Does anybody know how old this facade is?
This facade is
When was it redone? Yeah, I was going to say, it looks pretty new.
It's very recent.
And, you know, again, I don't know any of the history of this building.
Here's the facade what it looked like, historic shot. So you see they really did try to replicate.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would. Well, you can tell
You know,
Yeah,
living
that might not
closer to
stay
your
there,
phone
but
around,
the hazards
I
of
love
cell
how we got
phone.
that right away.
you know, one of the rules of thumb for any buildings where you're trying to
Figure out what was there originally is to base it on historical documentation, and be that a historic photograph or a ghosting line when things are removed. And if you don't have that kind of information, you don't want to put a very fancy conjectural facade or storefront back or a feature back there. You might want to put we say, contemporary and compatible facade, that it may be a more modern storefront that works with the proportions of the building, but you're not trying to make up a design that wasn't there originally, or fancy, make a building more elaborate than it was historically. But I think in this case, they did have a historic photograph, and it looks like they pretty carefully tried to replicate that, and so that would meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. And then the ongoing debate about where substitute materials are appropriate sort of follows that.
now,
Well, I think there's definitely different storefront issues. I think there's we can talk about them here, but we've got some other areas further down the sidewalk that I think we could definitely observe what they've done here, which is they've added a double glazing, and a lot of times what happens when you do that is that you have to really bulk up the muttons and the mullions to handle them, and so it makes it difficult to do that. It's clearly they've gone for fairly significant pieces of glass. We'd want to look at the historic picture again, the historic picture to see how close they got, but you can see above.
There's a historic picture right in the window.
oh,
of
Jazz,
the building.
how convenient.
There it is. And from that historic picture, we can't quite tell how this was dealt with at the top.
No, but you can,
You can come pretty close. Sometimes you don't get every detail right, but you, I think they were at least trying here to.
Yeah, it looks like this needed to get introduced in order to handle the.
Yeah. Oh, I see.
Well, if you look up the other thing, hazard is, the new materials might cause new maintenance preservation problems. I mean, I don't know, you see some
Looks like it was sandblasted.
cracking, moisture, I don't know.
There is that. Different types of materials have different characteristics physically, and some expand. Buildings are always moving. Moisture is always getting in. It's not easy to maintain a building over time, and they do change. And one of the things that we'll see a lot in sort of dealing with storefronts, and the lecture that Anthony Rubano gave this morning, is that storefronts usually have about a 25-year cycle. Fashions change, marketing for retail changes, so storefronts it's hard to find an original storefront. And there are some examples here in Faribault, but sometimes they're just components. Often the top of the building stays the same and the storefront changes, so that's an ever-evolving piece of the building.
Yeah, I think part of the problem with, say, this substitute material is how do you maintain it? And so many of our modern materials are maintenance-free.
yeah,
which,
if someone tells you a product is maintenance-free, run. If someone tells you a product is maintenance-free, run in the other direction. There is no such thing as a maintenance-free product.
it means that it can't be maintained. Essentially, the translation.
It means it fails, you don't. It's replaceable, though. It's not a good sales pitch in the preservation world, so. Okay, let's keep going.
Does that include granite?
Well, granite is more durable, but granite can deteriorate.
They'll have to wipe it off at the very least. Yeah.
Just some components that we've noticed along the way. Very often we get proposals for storefronts that are stained like this. That is not a historically appropriate treatment. I probably don't know enough about the subject to know when there were examples of stained storefronts, but generally, sort of in the Victorian area, the storefronts were painted. I would think in this weather, if you do stain a storefront, it's not going to last very long. So you may be coming back and painting it anyway, but this is not a historically appropriate treatment. And if it was... Oh, okay. Sorry, I think my transmitter is down the street. Oh, we're not... I'm telling you, we'll get it eventually. Oh, she's got it right here. It's coming on. Okay, here we go. So anyway, if this was coming in for tax credits, we would require that the storefront be painted because that would be more historically appropriate.
Probably lasts better too.
Oh, as I was saying, definitely lasts better, and this is going to start to show its age.
As you can see, even our super poly finishes can't hold up to much weather, and again, right here on the street, salt.
It must have got turned.
Is it on?
I wanted to draw attention to a couple of different storefronts right here. One is a replacement storefront, and one is a completely different, what you think of as a storefront. So I think starting with the bank here is just remembering when we talk about storefronts, what is typical. And this is a completely banks are very typical Main Street buildings, but they don't fit into the transom, lots of glazing, and
You're not putting like a retail store. You're not putting products out there. I guess like a retail store, you're not putting products out that you're trying to display, but there's a real street presence to a bank or to a different institutional or other types of commercial buildings. So this is important to understand that this kind of still falls under the storefront category, and the primary elevation of a building, which is most important, and the front entry. I mean, this bank is saying a lot. You see Security Bank, and you've got this huge, sort of limestone door. Oh no, it's not limestone. I'm sorry. It's glazed terracotta doorway, but they're making a big statement here, and so it's important. You talk about character defining or features of a building. Well, that front entry is very important, and somewhere in your little packet that I gave you, I also talk about front doors. I wouldn't say this is a particularly compatible front door here or arrangement. That is not original. A bank would have had a much more impressive set of double doors there and some kind of ornamentation where that for rent sign is. And it may be under that corrugated metal. Sometimes it's a case of peeling back some of the unsympathetic treatments over time, and you may find a treasure which lurks below. But I think Natascha's point about this is no less important in terms of sort of storefronts and presence on the Main Street.
yeah, and just also that, I mean, it would be easily to fall under, I mean, this is a very impressive front. So when someone comes to you with what's historically a bank, and they're proposing a storefront, and they say, well, that fits into the typical storefront. I don't have documentation for what it should be, but we know if it was a bank or something like that, we know which direction we probably want to head rather than that direction.
I have one more point I want to make.
I have one more point I want to make about this in terms of substitute materials. I made the mistake of saying that was limestone, where the columns in the entry are really glazed terracotta. The idea of substitute materials is not new because glazed terracotta was actually a substitute for stone. It was cheaper and easy to manufacture, and so this is just an earlier form of substitute material that they used.
story is occupied, roughly?
I can see a plant up there, as in a house plant. I can also see a plant on the.
No, I just meant about 50%.
In general, down.
50% or less is what we.
50%?
The previous tour said that about 60% of this one, and almost 100% of that other apartment building is full both with elevator problems. But they're currently doing a second and third story study right now of the housing.
Okay, and then we have here another storefront. We have the tattoo parlor. And then we also have this, what, it's I think an antique store, or thrift store down there. And you can see that historically it was 2 storefronts. But we have a later, what do we think, 50s storefront with a really appropriate awning. And the question about, I think there's a nice enigma here about wasn't appropriate when they added the 50 storefront to unify 2 different buildings and make them look like one. However, now we have what might be a contributing facade unifying the 2 storefronts. And there was just a kind of a discussion, obviously, a little bit ago, and Anthony, is this contributing? And I think there's some better examples that we might talk about further down, but remembering standard 4.
Standard 4 of the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation talks about features that have gained in significance over time. So they may not be original to the historic building, but they may become historic in their own right. We talk about periods of significance for a historic district, and I don't know what the period of significance for Faribault is, but the rule of thumb is if it's 50 years or older, but there are exceptions to that. But here we have a facade that's probably from the 1950s. It's been there for a good long time. And the debate, we always have ongoing debates, that's what makes our job so interesting. The debate is that, has that gained in significance, and should that stay, or should that be taken out and the buildings sort of separated again and no longer unified, and more historic front that relates more to the original period of construction installed. So I can't tell you the right answer here. There's rarely a right answer.
To take it out?
Don't put me on the spot like that. Would I approve it for tax credits to take it out? We'd have to answer some questions first.
Are the standards for restoration ever applied in a...
The standards for restoration, just in a nutshell, the Secretary of the Interior Standards for the treatment of historic buildings, there are 4 treatment standards, and we talk about them in terms of intervention, in order of intervention, starting with preservation, which is basically preserving the building as it is. You can do some updates to the building, but you're not taking anything away. The rehabilitation standards, which we use to review tax credit projects, are kind of the most flexible and the most commonly used, and they're used for kind of living, breathing, working buildings in today's economy. And that kind of, you inherit the building as it is today, and you take into account how it's evolved, and you have, as a point of discussion of, what are significant attributes to that building, but it also entertains the possibility of removing things if they're inappropriate, or adding things if they're appropriate as well. And next in line is restoration, which is a little bit more precious. It takes a period of time. I always use George Washington's house in Mount Vernon was restored to when George Washington lived in that house, and there were things that had been added on over the years. Those were taken out. So it's a much more kind of museum-type approach to handling a historic building. And the 4th is reconstruction, and we use Colonial Williamsburg, where, based on historical documentation, vanished features were reconstructed. So for the purpose of this discussion today, we're talking about rehabilitation. So we do restore some features, and sometimes these 4 categories do overlap at times. But basically, it's kind of rehabilitation. Sometimes you can take things away, sometimes you can add things. Very often you have to kind of leave as much historic fabric as possible. So.
Wouldn't they?
Coming back to your question, I think one of the most important parts to think about when you're using the rehabilitation standards, but you're trying to decide whether restoration is appropriate or not. In a building like this, one of the first questions is, do you have historic documentation of what it looked like? It's the first question. So if someone came to the commission and said, we want to restore these 2 facades, but they didn't have a picture of it, and they said, we're gonna go old-timey and put in something that we think might have what it kind of sort of was. That's really not, that's gonna be a hard point to argue. So, and especially when you're removing a facade that's been there for 60 years. Now, if they come back and they say, look at this material, it's pierced in a mazillion places, nobody really knows how to repair, but I'm thinking maybe Bondo apparently has been proposed. What is probably
Bondo is not a
Enamel,
it's probably this enamel. Yeah, it's enamel panel. This is probably a metal panel that's enameled. How do you repair that? And I think that's not only our materials now, when in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s we started to use materials that weren't typically used and weren't meant to be repaired. So if someone has a facade and they say, I just don't know, there's no one who knows how to repair that, and it's just going to destroy the building ultimately because we have all these issues with the facade and they have good documentation, maybe that's appropriate. Is this in the period of significance? We could debate quite a while about what is the period of significance. Right now, there's kind of two. There's the district up here that's much more specific, the National Register District, this block is much more specific to the 1850s through 1900, and the rest of kind of what we think of as downtown Faribault is a locally certified district, which kind of opens it up much more to a different full time period of the history of Faribault. And the discussion between, well, the main campaign for building ended in the 30s in Faribault, because that's when a lot of the, things kind of came to a real slow halt. But is the history past that main building campaign period unsignificant? Question. Oh, yeah.
All right.
What if I come in with two pictures of this building? One's 1910 and one's 1970. Which is significant? Because
That would be
very different.
It would be very different. And I think part of that question is really ultimately, in some respects, comes down to documentation, what we can bring back, and whether, I think one of the main questions for me would be is how intact is this facade? And can we repair it? I don't know what you would use. And part of it is a local question too.
Once again, part of the debate, lots of questions that you have to ask along the way to come to these conclusions. And that's a good way of saying, I'm not committing myself at this moment.
Well, and as the Park Service often says, that each building is its own self. And so part of sometimes the question comes down to how intentional was that facade? Was that something that somebody slapped up because they just needed to repair something because it was broken, and so they kind of put something over it and it looks kind of 70s, but how intentional is it?
How good of an example of that time period that this new facade is reflecting is that still on that building? I mean, you can have a facade that got put up that's a really great example from that time period, and it's still in good condition, relatively speaking, or can be repaired and brought back to good condition with reasonable amount of work, versus is it a horrible example?
Well,
and if you see
yeah.
good examples of something, most people, even if they're unfamiliar with architecture, are going to be able to look at a really great example and a poor one and say, oh, that is disgusting.
The kind of the good example, bad example, ultimately really shouldn't, in my mind, come down to, was the architect famous? Is it really well designed? Part of it comes down to, technically speaking, when we're looking at earlier stuff, which is what we're used to looking at in the period of significance, we don't ask the question, is that a good design or not?
No, that's true.
We ask the question, is it intact? Is it repairable? And so really ultimately we need to decide, and this is a big debate, and each commission is going to kind of sort this out as we go, and Audrey and I have to sort this out as we go too, is when do we say that? I don't know if you want to.
Can you talk about it, whether if you are evaluating these stores in relation to this local district and this town, as opposed to evaluating them in relation to the real estate, property, architectural evolution of the Kresge Corporation across America?
That is definitely very true. I mean, if there's comes into it, like let's say in Northfield, there's the bank that Jesse James robbed. And that building got transformed into what I think is a very cute 1930s kind of, stuccoed over, fake brick kind of Tudory thing. I have a great sympathy for and affinity for that type of modification. Some buildings were built that way initially. Now, does the fact that Jesse James robbed that bank in what year, Sarah? 1876. Sarah, yes, burned into their brain. In 1876, does that override the importance of everything else? And can they essentially completely deconstruct that facade and rebuild the Jesse James facade? At an earlier point, it was decided, yeah, they can. That building is special in Northfield. It's in the district. It's very special. Now, as we're getting closer, as the period goes on, that decision was made about 12 years ago, I think, and everyone was very confident about that decision. If we were starting at the beginning point, I wouldn't be as confident about that decision. It's obviously very important for Northfield. Northfield feels very strongly about that. But at this point, the facade has been half restored. So you kind of got to then do it.
Can't be
You just got to go all the way. Is Kresge a really important part of Faribault, I was going to say Northfield, or did Jesse James rob that store, but it's not individually listed, it's part of the district?
There's probably bullet holes in that facade.
Yeah, that's what that is. That wasn't a sign.
There we go.
But Jack does bring up a point that Kresge, for those who, it was at a five and dime department store. It was kind of a Woolworths type. I'm sorry, it was part of Kmart, of course. And it's a very, you see Kresge's throughout the country, and they very often have these metal paneled or Carrera glass or something, but more metal paneled, I would think, facades. And is that a period of history that that's the part of the evolution of Faribault, of this main street with that five and dime there. So I keep coming back to, this is what makes our jobs interesting, and it's part of the debate, and we're never really answering your questions. But these are tough calls, and eventually you'll come to some conclusion about it, but it isn't always easy, and there are lots of variables, and I think you can't really dismiss the importance of Kresge, but then somebody else may argue that who's Mr. Faribault, way before, anyway, never mind. But there may be some other historical aspect that would justify taking down that Kresge storefront and restoring the buildings, separating the buildings and restoring them to where they were originally. So lots and lots of challenges.
Well, do you ever, within that debate, do you ever look at the future, even though you're dealing with the present and the past, saying, okay, let's say that Kresge, we claim that piece historic, we need to preserve that. Okay, then what about Walmart? Are you setting a precedent? I guess my question is, where do you open that? Where do you open that door? I mean, are you? These are all kinds. I mean, it's.
She said, what do we do? What happens if Walmart? What are we going to do with a Walmart in the future? Thank goodness I'll be retired by then, and we won't get to that point. But she does bring up a good point that you look to the future. I think we kind of have to deal with the present and the past, but
then, what are the decisions we make in the present? Do we
take into consideration? Well, certainly economics of a main street do come into play. Somehow the preservation world and the business world have to come together. I don't know. This is getting a bit involved. Maybe we should walk on. But
well, I think I could add one item is that I've been asked, why aren't these standards more quantitative. I want quantitative standards. And I say
Well,
that to
because
them,
of this,
you
Tom,
just
so I
not
mean, this
want to
is-
see quantitative standards. And it allows for our growth and understanding about history and how
things
the
do
right way to
evolve.
treat it.
We're not static, and we can't have absolutes. I mean, things move on, and there are all different types of considerations. So, yes, some things are definite. Those, recommended. Some things are definite recommended and not recommended. But even there's recommended and not recommended. It's not you do not do this and you do not do that. There is some flexibility built into this for for all kinds of reasons and for all kinds of communities and materials and
I'm sorry, just a quick question. I don't know if this is allowed. Why is that building so unique to all the other buildings around here?
There was a discussion, maybe we can jump into a little bit of masonry. There was a discussion on, oh, sorry?
Is it Olaf Hansen design?
Oh, well, here we go.
Olaf Hansen.
Olaf Hansen?
Is it?
Okay. And I don't know who Olaf
Burkhart
Hansen.
Myers is
Local limestone.
Local limestone. And can you tell me, we had some debate, and maybe this, in your packet, we may have gotten it wrong and said it was Casota stone. Do you think it's Casota stone? You don't think it is? Okay, well.
It might be
It's
below.
local.
No, it's local. It's that
It's-
Faribault limestone.
A Faribault
Faribault
limestone.
limestone,
Okay,
yeah.
so I think I may have gotten it wrong, as you have figured out by now. We don't always get it right. But there are local materials that are very important to not only they sort of locally quarried, but they can really make a place unique because you don't see these materials elsewhere. And there's a real variation. I mean, you can be in Faribault, you can be in Northfield, and there are things that are available. Certainly as transportation developed and people could move things around more easily, local materials were no longer local and you could find them elsewhere. But early buildings are pretty unique to the town. Should be respected, I think is my point.
This is a quick stop on the substitute materials question. Is the historic material obviously has suffered a lot, and is it appropriate to use sandstone again, or do we want to go to something that might actually be more durable? Can you find we have approved in the past, substitute man-made stone that looks a lot like sandstone, but will actually stand up better than sandstone, because obviously the building is significantly suffering at this point, probably because of rising dam, but also because of salts, which is kind of hard to avoid. And even as a building owner, if you decide I don't want salt, the city does it for you. So, is anything you want to add on that?
No, but this is a sort of a common problem sort of throughout the country where this beautiful sandstone is very, very deteriorated. And there's also the debate, yet another debate for you to add to your list, of whether the original material was appropriate and has failed over time. And what do you do with that? So. This is a perfect example, which if you've probably been on the walking tours, it's probably been included in every single one of them, where obviously you have a much later, sort of 1930s, well, the jeweler was established in 1925, but, 1930s, I would say, is a guess, but it's kind of deco facade. It doesn't match the significantly older building above, but it's certainly gained in significance and should be retained. So, luckily this kind of thing is in fashion now. But you'd be surprised at how people want to pull stuff off their building So anyway, this would definitely be an example of what's gained in significance.
Yeah, and this is kind of an easy example of the gain in significance, because I think, and as Audrey said, coming in fashion, and we're all learning to really appreciate this. I really appreciate it. So it makes it an easier question, and that leads to kind of why are we being arbitrary about those later facades that aren't maybe as attractive, and trying to make it more of a non-subjective thing. But of course we look at this and we think it's great, but we will notice that there are some inappropriate modifications in the glazing here, and these windows are no longer, so there could be new, the window replacements are not.
It's also been
not appropriate, and strangely painted.
You can see that the original white stripe here was a much sort of cloudier.
So that would be an interesting question about how to remove that paint.
Or
Testing on an unseen corner.
Or whether you should just patch the paint and leave it alone. Or whether you should just patch that painting and leave it alone. You know, there are debates in that.
I did notice that with the plaque, they were very good and did not bolt here. I looked to check that.
They didn't bolt.
They didn't bolt into the.
That's a good example. They bolted into the modern yucky materials, but not into the glass, which is good. We saw an example across the street where they drilled the preservation plaque right into the into the historic masonry. That's not.
I think these three buildings here on the end are an interesting collection of issues. First, I think we can look at windows on the upper stories here. I think we see here on the upper story pretty good window replacements. The glass is kind of reflective. We see the low E, but it seems really, the Park Service allows for a low E coating, least reflective pyrolytic coating, and that's about the best you can really do.
As clear as possible, because low E tends, we want to avoid tinted glass. Tinted glass can really change the character of a building that historically had clear glass. And low E coatings have gotten better, so they've gotten a lot clearer. So sometimes we'll ask for glass samples to make sure that we don't get this sort of dark tinted glass that you associate with the 70s and 80s. And
which we missed on the tattoo parlor. Where did that
there's
go?
some tinted, if you want to go get a tattoo,
I think we missed it back there. The tattoo parlor has a not good storefront with tinted glass and really heavy replacement. Then we have here a lovely example of a bad window replacement, because not only are you kind of fell short there of filling in the full opening, and I think it's kind of an extreme example that everybody knows. We wouldn't let everyone fill in the whole top half of those windows now, but I think always trying to make sure they're much more subtle versions of that question, and whether or not they get put in exactly the right kind of location. Sometimes they can be installed flush with the front of the building, and so that's inappropriate. They can be different shapes. They can be different types of windows. If somebody tried to install a casement window in there, or
I think one of the things we forgot to do, and I don't mean to cut Natascha off here, is to start the window debate, and I should have started this before. I don't know how many of you heard Bob Yap's talk yesterday morning when he said, I've never replaced a window in 165,000 rehabilitations or something like that. But starting the discussion of windows, which are always very controversial in preservation, and there's this ongoing debate with the energy community and about the efficiency of windows. If you're lucky enough to have the historic windows in there, they're probably, and from buildings from, this is 1878, you're going to have really heavy-duty wood, old-growth windows. Count the growth rings. If you got wood windows today, they wouldn't be the same. No way, no how. So you're always better, and it's always more appropriate, because windows can also be very much a contributor of the character of the building, to retain and repair historic windows whenever possible, and boost their energy efficiency with storm windows and plugging them up for air infiltration, etc. So, but very often you're starting with replacement windows. The historic windows are long gone, and you want to put sympathetic, compatible replacement windows in their place, and that's kind of where Natascha started on this discussion, but I wanted to sort of backtrack a little bit to remind you that retaining historic windows is of utmost importance, and also a really sustainable thing to do, because that window, if carefully repaired, will last another 100 years, and a replacement unit will probably last 15. Replacement vinyl or aluminum, whatever, they can't be repaired. They can't be recycled. They're going to end up in a landfill. So stop that cycle of removal and replacement before it starts, if you have that option. And if you don't have that option, then let's try to get a replacement window in there that's appropriate.